So I'm going to walk you guys through my first ever cold approach. I'll take you through the steps that led to that moment. I know for a lot of you guys, taking that first step is the biggest barrier. And so I'm confident that my story can give you some direction if you plan on going out there and doing this for the first time. Without wasting time, let's get straight into it. In my journey, before I did my first cold approach, I'd been watching a lot of content, and I'm sure you've been in that position, or you are in that position, where there's just so much information out there, different creators suggesting different techniques. In fact, I'm now one of those guys, right? I'm telling you my way of doing things, or at least what worked for me, and that might be different to what you've heard from somebody else. So it can be a lot to deal with in terms of the information overload. But when I first started, I was consuming as much content as possible because I wanted to build that knowledge base so that I had enough theory to give me the confidence to go out there. When I got started, once I'd consumed a decent amount of theory, I decided to take a more progressive plan. Instead of just, going out into the street and approaching a beautiful woman from the get-go, I decided to sort of work my way towards it. And so I took incremental steps towards my first approach. The first thing I did was I would go to my town center and I would go and ask women for the time. And I would tell her, yeah, my phone died and I don't have my watch. Do you happen to have the time on you? I'm running late for something. And then, I would just try and practice going out there and just stopping a woman in broad daylight around people. And you might think it's a silly thing to do, or you might think it's pointless, or you might think, how is this ever going to help me to cold approach? But essentially what I was trying to do with that technique is get used to getting myself in front of the girls and being able to stop them, being able to command my voice. So that was a great way for me to just overcome that fear of the approach anxiety. Of course, it was easier because I wasn't going in there giving a compliment, but there was still that anxiety. At the time, I was fairly self-conscious because I wasn't used to talking to people outside unless I knew them. So there's always going to be that anxiety when you approach a stranger, regardless of what you're asking them for. It was a good way for me to start, essentially warming up that approach muscle. After that, the second step was to start talking to strangers more often. Somebody on a podcast that I listened to recently, he described it as flirting with the world. Essentially what it is you talk to people in your everyday life. It could be, the barista when you're getting a coffee. It could be the shop assistant when you're buying some clothes at H&M. It could be, the bus driver. It could be the Uber driver. It could be the guy who's sat next to you on the train. Anybody really, anybody who you don't know, who's in your vicinity, you just try and strike up a conversation. And I started doing this more and more often before I even did my first cold approach. That was something that really helped me, again, develop that confidence to go up to people and hold a conversation, ask them questions, introduce myself, try and establish some sort of rapport, some sort of connection. And I would do that with all sorts of people. Of course, I wasn't just doing that with women. I would talk to random guys, older women, younger guys. I would just talk to really anybody who seemed interesting. If I saw somebody with a cool hoodie, I would just go and give them a compliment and tell them, hey man, I like your hoodie. Where did you get it from? And then would have a conversation about that. So I was doing that for a couple of weeks. So I would say those first two incremental steps should help you get used to being outside and putting yourself in that social arena, which can be very difficult if you're introverted like myself. If anything, I prefer to just have my AirPods in or my earpods in and just go about my business, get my coffee, do my shopping, not really talk to too many people. But if you want to get good at cold approach, especially if you're going to do this solo, which I think most guys are going to try doing this solo when they first start, then I think you need to work your way up slowly. Now, having said that, I I did all this warming up in terms of talking to strangers and asking women for the time. And then I eventually decided to go out on a weekend and do my first approach. And so this story is actually the story of the first time I tried it but failed. I literally walked around for probably 2 hours and did not approach a single woman, did not approach a single person, did not have a single conversation. It was a complete failure. This is fairly normal. I think I've spoken to a lot of guys who have been in cold approach. They've all tried to go out and, do an approach by themselves. And a lot of them just simply weren't able to do it. And then they got coaching, which I think is the best way to go about it, because you learn the skill set with the best technique from the beginning, rather than having to figure it out by yourself. And also, of course, you get the support of somebody next to you, which gives you more confidence and more freedom to make mistakes. But there's other people like myself who, eventually got their first approach solo, but initially they had some days where they just couldn't do it. In my case, I was just way too much in my head. I was thinking way too many steps ahead. I was so concerned about what other people were going to think, and I was very fixated on having a good outcome. And so the fear in my body, the anxiety, even the adrenaline in my body, as soon as I wanted to go and make that move when I saw the girl, it was so intense that I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And so I would see someone, I would think about it, I would go, and then I would bail. And I just did that like multiple times throughout that evening. I think my mistake was I'd essentially woken up, showered, got dressed, and then went to do a session. And I'd done that without talking to a single person, without interacting with anybody. As a beginner, as somebody who hasn't ever done an approach, that's way more important than you think. And so it's important not to bash yourself too much if you go out and you don't do any reps, because, it just is part of the process. And I think the most important thing is just to not lose enthusiasm, try and figure out, okay, how can I make this easier for myself? And then go out again and just plan another session and then try again. Because just because you failed once, it doesn't mean that you're going to fail forever. So that was my first failed outing. I told myself, okay, I'll try it again next weekend, which is what I did. So this is now the story of my actual first approach, which actually went successful. I went to London. I only gave myself the goal of approaching one woman. And so that was the intention when I left the house. I got onto the train. I wanted to try and warm myself up. And so a couple sat opposite me on the train, and the guy, he had a really cool jacket. In that moment, I thought, okay, this would be a nice opportunity to just have a conversation, warm up my social, let's say, muscle. I was very nervous in that moment to give the guy the compliment. When I thought about saying something, again, I started to feel those butterflies. My heart rate really started to go up. And I very quickly realized that even when it comes to just talking to people in these environments, there was so much anxiety and fear around that, because it was a stranger, because it was in a public setting, because there were other people around. Of course, in a train, it's a bit more intense because it's not a very transient environment. So you're just sat in the carriage, and if things get awkward, then you just have to sit there and deal with that sort of weird, awkward tension. As I was feeling those negative emotions, I was thinking to myself, why am I so nervous to give a guy a compliment? Like, it shouldn't be so scary to just pay somebody a compliment on what they're wearing and then ask them where they got it and strike up a conversation. I mean, we're social beings, we're social creatures. It shouldn't be that difficult, right? And so in that moment, I actually got pissed off with myself. And I was like, fuck this. Why am I so scared? I don't want to be a pussy. Let me just give this guy the compliment. Whatever happens, happens. But I'm not going to bail on this. If I bail on the approach in London, fine. I get that, because it's hard to give women a compliment outside in public. It's a very scary thing to do. fine. I can live with myself if I bail again. But when it comes to just giving a guy a compliment on his jacket, the fact that that was so scary, it just pissed me off. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it even if I'm scared. It was funny because they had sat down in their seats, and then I thought about giving him the compliment for like, it must have been 5 minutes. We'd already gone past like 1 or 2 stops on the journey. And then eventually, despite the fear, I told him, hey man, very random, but I like your jacket, bro. Like, where did you get it from? And then he just went, oh, thank you, man. And then he told me where he got it from. And then his girlfriend chipped in and she told me that, yeah, they bought it the other day. And then we just had a whole conversation for literally 40 minutes towards London. I left that conversation feeling really, really good. Yeah, I was on a bit of a social high. And more importantly, I was just proud of myself for getting over that initial fear. I essentially took that momentum and I arrived at my, let's say, cold approach area. I wanted to make the most of this energy that I had. So I walked around for about maybe 10-15 minutes before I saw someone that was just stood still. She was really, really attractive. And she was in a fairly quiet area. There were people around, but it wasn't too busy. And she wasn't walking, so it's always easier to approach somebody who stood still. And so I think, yeah, and she was also on her phone. And so I saw her and I debated with myself for about maybe 2 minutes. But then I thought, okay, this is a really good opportunity. It won't be any easier than this. So it's now or never. And so even though my heart rate was still elevated and I was certainly very anxious and I was definitely like kind of looking around a bit, I had enough confidence, and importantly, I was warmed up enough to sort of push through that resistance. And so I went up to her. I think I just said, hi, you look really good. And then she just smiled and said, oh, thank you. And she was a bit shy. And of course, I was really shy as well. But she smiled, she took it well. We ended up talking for maybe 5 to 6 minutes. She ended up being from Kuwait, but she was studying in London. Like, I think she was studying pharmacy. Yeah, we had a nice little generic chit chat. I mean, it was probably very platonic. And I don't have the audio recording or anything like that, but I imagine it wasn't the most, flirty conversation in the world, especially compared to my conversations nowadays. But either way, it went well. She was engaged, and I eventually got her number. She responded to my text message a few hours later. And yeah, we texted back and forth for a couple of weeks, but she was actually going back to Kuwait for the winter. So we didn't actually end up meeting again, unfortunately. But that doesn't really matter. The point is, I got that first approach in. And I remember after that approach, I turned around and I just kind of went to myself and went, oh my God, like, wow, I just did that. Like, I was so proud of myself. I remember it was a sunny day and just, it felt as if the sunlight was brighter. My senses were heightened. I just felt like I'd reached another level of like euphoria. I was so just excited and elevated. My spirits were up. I was like, walking around with a bit more, like energy and bounce. And I kind of felt like I had aura. It was this weird wave of confidence and energy that was just all over me. I'd never felt anything like that before. Or if I had, it must have been a long time ago. And then there was also a lot of relief, right? Because I was so scared of what was going to happen. I thought that she might think I'm creepy, or she might reject me, and then people would see and I would be super embarrassed and it would be awkward. But because that didn't happen, there was so much relief as well. So you can imagine, I'm relieved, excited, euphoric. All these emotions are just pouring over me. I will never forget that first approach, and I will never forget that first day, because it was such a pivotal moment in my life. And I don't say that with any sort of exaggeration. I really mean it, because that was the first time I'd truly faced my fear in the most direct way. The amazing feeling I got at the end of facing that fear was a revelation to me, because it told me that, okay, if I face my fears, then more often than not, there's going to be something good at the end of it. And so I would say just some closing thoughts on doing your first approach. I think the first thing I would say is just focus on taking that first step. Yeah, whether it's the incremental steps where you have to warm up in terms of talking to strangers or asking for directions or talking to women, but just asking for something simple like the time. Giving yourself, enough time to slowly work your way up towards the actual approach, because we're all starting at different points. Some of us are more socially calibrated than others. If you're somebody who really doesn't speak to anybody and you're very scared of talking to people, maybe you struggle to make eye contact with people, then, trying to go from here to there is going to be quite difficult. Yeah, you want to just focus on taking the first step, whatever that might be for you. Of course, you know yourself better than anybody, so it's important to just be honest with yourself and say, okay, I don't think I can go out and do an approach in a busy part of my city, but I can certainly, try and strike up a conversation with the barista, or I can just give somebody a compliment or ask somebody for the time. To work your way up and just build that momentum. On a similar point, don't think too many steps ahead. There's a tendency to be focused on, oh, I want the conversation to go well. I want her to like me. How do I get her number? XYZ. In reality, all you have to focus on is just getting in front of her and just saying hi, and then give a compliment. That's it. Don't focus on anything else. Don't think about what she might react to, what she might say, what other people might say. Of course, those are going to be thoughts that will race through your mind, but try your best to just drown out those thoughts and just tell yourself, okay, just say hi. Just say hi, give the compliment. Simple. I think most importantly is you have to drop your ego. I'll say it again. You have to drop your ego. You have to allow yourself to suck at first. You have to allow yourself to be bad, because nobody goes into this an expert. And I think for some reason we think that we have to be smooth or super charismatic when it comes to our first approach. But like any other skill, if you're starting from zero, then it's really silly to think that you're going to be good at the first attempt. You need to detach your ego from the outcome and accept that it might not go as planned. She might not be receptive, and it might be awkward, it might be disappointing, and you have to just accept that as a part of the process. If you can go in with that mentality, then it will reduce the burden and you won't feel so much pressure to be perfect. You allow yourself to just take action without having this, high level of confidence, because you build confidence by putting in more reps. You don't just have confidence by saying, oh, I have confidence and therefore I'm going to be amazing. No, you have to take your licks. You have to put your reps in order to be good. That's how the universe works. The more volume you put in, the more you learn, the better you get. And that's the way that I approached it. And it's gotten me to where I am today, right? And I have an abundant dating life, and I'm way more confident than I've ever been in my entire life. I've grown into such a strong person who's able to handle adversity, and my perspective on how to handle fear, how to push through fear, how to go after what I want, and also just my general skills in terms of communication skills, body language, assertiveness, directness. All of this has blossomed and reached a new height that I never could have imagined, simply because I took that first step on September 14th, 2024 last year. If I'd never taken that first step, or if I'd thought too many steps ahead, or if I didn't drop my ego, then I wouldn't be here right now talking to you and having these great experiences. And so I encourage you to just, like I said, just focus on that first step and then let the rest take care of itself. It's funny. Last night I just had an amazing night, an amazing romantic night with a girl that I met through Cold Approach. about 2 weeks ago. I was driving back home after I dropped her off last night in London, and I was thinking to myself in my car how far I've come since that first approach. You know, it's been a year and about 2 months, or a year and a month since that first approach, and I've just grown so much. My life then compared to now is just completely different, and I sort of had to pinch myself as I was driving back, because I couldn't believe that I was dating the kind of girls I'm dating now, and I had the number of options that I have now, and I had the level of confidence that I have now, even to be able to be on camera and talk about my experiences. I'm doing so many things that I thought were somewhat impossible, and again, it all started with that first step. And so I hope you can also take that first step. I hope this was useful. If you liked what you saw and what you heard, then yeah, feel free to give the video a like. Otherwise, good luck. Peace out.